Chamber was still when it happened, that sharp, cutting voice tearing through the air like glass shattering on marble. "You are an embarrassment." Tim Scott's words cracked against the walls, echoing through the room so loud and so sudden that even the hum of the cameras seemed to falter for a beat. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. The aides froze mid-scribble, pens hovering over yellow legal pads. Porter's instinct taking over, swung their lenses toward the source, fingers twitching against the shutter buttons. The sound of cameras clicking filled the silence like rainfall, each frame capturing every micro-expression, every twitch of an eyebrow, every hint of tension rippling through the room. Across the dais, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat there, perfectly still, her eyes steady, her face unreadable, a portrait of calm as the storm raged in front of her. Around her, heads turned. A few mouths fell open in disbelief. The look on some faces said everything. Did he really just say that? And then came the uneasy murmur, low and hushed, as if no one quite knew whether to react or retreat. The staffers exchanged glances, the kind that carried entire conversations, a mix of shock, discomfort, and a dawning realization that this was no longer just another tense exchange in a long, grinding day of hearings. Something was breaking loose. The cameras zoomed closer. The lights seemed harsher. Every angle, every frame. Bratz lived to a nation that had already grown used to watching these proceedings like serialized drama. Only this wasn't scripted. This was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to look away from. Tim Scott leaned forward, shoulders tight, jaw set, a man who believed volume equaled authority. His words dripped with a kind of performative rage meant to humiliate, to dominate, to silence. But across from him sat someone who refused to play by those rules. Jasmine's stillness was louder than his shouting, her silence more piercing than any rebuttal. And yet, in that moment, no one, not the reporters, not the staffers, not even Tim Scott himself could have predicted what would come next. Asterisk. The chamber was already simmering long before the cameras started rolling. Weeks of partisan brawls had turned every hearing into a battlefield, every exchange into a headline. Across America, families were glued to their screens, watching a country wrestling with itself, questions of race, of power, of who truly belongs in the story of America. And in that room, under the blinding fluorescent lights, those questions were about to collide in a way no one could have scripted. This wasn't just another committee meeting. It was a stage, and everyone there knew it. Every statement, every glare, every subtle smirk was calibrated for the millions who would dissect every second online. The stakes weren't abstract. They were deeply personal. For millions of Americans, immigrants chasing the promise of a better life, black families, carrying the weight of generations of struggle, working-class folks tired of being invisible, this hearing felt like more than politics. It felt like a test of dignity itself, and Tim Scott came ready to perform. His words, sharp and rehearsed, carried the weight of someone who'd been waiting for this spotlight. To him, this was an opportunity to reaffirm the old hierarchies, to remind everyone who held the gavel and who didn't. To Jasmine Crockett, though, it was different. She wasn't there for theatrics. She was there for the people who had sent her, people whose voices were rarely heard in rooms like this, people who knew what it felt like to have their worth questioned simply for existing. Outside the chamber, America was a tinderbox. The news cycles had been dominated by stories of injustice, by viral clips of lawmakers talking at people rather than to them. Social media was buzzing, polarized, and primed, waiting for the next spark. And in that moment, as the cameras panned across the polished wood desks and tense faces, that spark was inevitable. Everyone sensed it, the aides shuffling papers. A little faster, the murmurs from the press corps, the way Scott leaned forward with that faint grin of someone spoiling for a fight. Crockett, calm and measured, didn't return the energy. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than his posturing. And that contrast alone was enough to make the air electric. And beyond the marble walls of that building, beyond the procedural motions and the gavel taps, an audience was waiting. Ordinary people, tired of watching dignity trampled by arrogance, were ready to rally behind someone who reflected their struggles, their quiet strength, their unshakable pride, what no one in that chamber fully understood, not yet, is that they were standing at the edge of a moment that would echo far beyond Washington. In less than 24 hours, hashtags would explode. Clips would spread like wildfire, dissected frame by frame, turned into rallying cries and memes and midnight conversations. What was about to happen wouldn't just trend. It would rewrite the narrative. And in that quiet before the storm, as Scott prepared his next volley and Crockett sat steady in her chair, you could almost feel the shift, that subtle, almost imperceptible moment when history holds its breath. Because what came next would change everything. Asterisk to the cameras. Tim Scott was always the picture of composure, the polished politician with the rehearsed smile and the well-tailored suit. He spoke in carefully measured tones, the kind that reassured donors and dazzled Sunday talk shows. To his base, he was the man who claimed to embody discipline, control, and reason. But behind the scenes, the mask told a different story, one of arrogance, volatility, and a need to dominate every room he entered. Colleagues whispered about the private moments no one saw on television. The slammed folders, the terse cutting, remarks to junior staffers, the quiet rage when the spotlight drifted anywhere but on him. He had built an entire career on the illusion of calm authority, but those closest to him knew how thin that veneer really was. And this wasn't the first time that illusion had cracked. There had been other moments, smaller, less public, when his temper had flared and his words had gone too far. Moments when he let his pride speak louder than his reason. Each time the machine around him worked overtime to spin, to distract, to bury the story before it gained traction. Each time it worked. Until now. What made this outburst different wasn't just the volume or the venom dripping from every syllable. It was the context, a cultural moment already stretched to its breaking point. An audience primed for outrage and cameras capturing every second in merciless high definition. Even in that chamber. As the echo of his words faded, you could see the cracks forming, the furrow in his brow, the twitch in his jaw, the way his hands tightened into fists on the desk in front of him. For a man who prided himself on control, the unraveling was impossible to miss. And yet in his mind, this was a show of strength, proof that he could dominate, that he could belittle anyone who dared to stand in his way. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see in that moment, was how quickly the ground beneath him was shifting. This wasn't the first time Tim Scott lost his temper, but this time would cost him everything. Long before the cameras found her, before the headlines called her a rising star, Jasmine Crockett was just a girl from humble beginnings. She grew up in a world where nothing was handed to you, where hard work wasn't a choice, but survival. The daughter of working-class parents who taught her that dignity wasn't measured by what you owned, but by how you carried yourself. Learned early that respect was something you earned and defended. She fought for every opportunity. Scholarships that came from late nights and early mornings. Jobs that barely paid the bills, but taught her the kind of grit that can't be faked. Law school wasn't just an academic dream. It was her way to give back, to build something bigger than herself. Every degree, every case she took on, every client she fought for, they weren't just wins on paper. They were proof that someone from her background could stand tall in rooms where people like her were never meant to belong. And when she stepped into public service, she didn't do it for power or spotlight. She did it for the communities she came from, the neighborhoods too often forgotten until election season rolled around. She became their voice, sharp and unapologetic, even when it meant ruffling feathers. Especially when it meant ruffling feathers. Critics tried to paint her as angry, as too bold, too loud, but Jasmine understood something they didn't, that criticism could be fuel. Every headline dripping with condescension only sharpened her resolve. Every whispered insult in those marble hallways only reminded her why she was there to show that integrity and service would always outlast arrogance and ego. Her strength wasn't in theatrics or volume. It was in her calm, in the way she could take a punch, verbal or political, and never let it shake her. in the way she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made even her harshest detractors hesitate. And that strength, that deep well of resilience carved out by years of fighting battles no one saw, would soon become the very thing that turned a heated hearing into a cultural flashpoint. Because when the storm came, Jasmine didn't flinch. She owned the moment. Started with an interruption, sharp, clipped, almost rehearsed. Tim Scott leaned forward, cutting her off mid-sentence, his voice riding over hers like a crashing wave. No, you don't get to twist this, he barked, his fingers stabbing the air for emphasis. The chamber tensed. You could feel it, the shift, the way the oxygen seemed to thin with every word he spat out. He raised his voice again, louder this time, anger spilling over the edges of his polished persona. It wasn't debate anymore. It was performance. Raw and unrestrained, meant to intimidate. Cameras caught the flash in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the way his voice cracked just slightly as frustration bled into fury. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't even raise her head from the stack of notes in front of her. That stillness, that deliberate, unbothered calm, only seemed to make him angrier. To the audience in the room, it was electric. To those watching online, it was mesmerizing. Rage versus .com, chaos versus control. The tension built in layers, his voice rising, his gestures sharper, while she sat there, almost statuesque. The staffers in the background shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to look down at their papers or at the spectacle unfolding in front of them. Even the press corps, usually immune to theatrics, leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing the start of something that would echo far beyond that room. And yet, through it all, Jasmine remained unshaken. Every insult rolled off her like rain. On glass, every interruption only bought her more time to let the weight of his outburst settle over the room. Time to let everyone see the imbalance for what it was. In living rooms across the country, viewers held their breath. They knew what they wanted, a response, a counter, a moment that would turn the tables, and Jasmine knew it too. She didn't rush. She didn't meet fire with fire. She let the silence do the heavy lifting, stretching it until it felt like the entire chamber was leaning in, waiting. Then, with a single breath, she began to speak. Asterisk, the silence before she spoke was thick enough to cut. Every eye in the chamber, every camera lens, every aide, every reporter locked onto her. Jasmine Crockett lifted her head slowly, her movements deliberate, almost surgical. She didn't meet his glare immediately. Then she glanced down at her notes, drew a breath so quiet it barely stirred the microphone, and then, in a voice steady and soft, but sharp enough to slice through stone, she began. "Senator," she said, not looking at him yet, "I hear your anger, but what you don't seem to understand is that anger isn't evidence." The room froze. Even the hum of the fluorescent light seemed too dull. Tim Scott blinked, his mouth tightening as though he'd been expecting a shout. A retort, something to match the fire he'd thrown her way. What he got instead was calm. Surgical calm that cut deeper than any outburst ever could. "You've spent the last 5 minutes," she continued, her tone unwavering, "trying to make this about noise, about volume, about who can talk over whom. But here's the thing, Senator. The facts don't care how loud you yell. They're still the facts." From the press bench, a camera zoomed in, catching the subtle flicker in his eyes, the first glint of doubt, the first tremor in the armor he'd been wearing all morning. She turned her gaze to him then. Finally, slowly, as if to say, "This moment belongs to me now. And maybe," she added, her voice tightening just slightly, "what really embarrasses you is that you can't intimidate me, that you can't make me small, that you can't shout me into silence the way you're used to." A ripple moved through the chamber, quiet but unmistakable. A staffer in the back blinked hard to keep a grin from breaking. A reporter, her eyes wide, jotted something furiously into her notebook. Even across the aisle, there were subtle nods, the kind you give when you've just watched someone land a punch you didn't see coming. Tim Scott shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his hands clasping the edge of the desk. He opened his mouth, ready to cut in again, but Jasmine didn't let him. She leaned in ever so slightly, closing the space between her and the microphone. "No, Senator, you've had your turn. Now it's my turn to speak." The firmness of her tone wasn't loud, but it reverberated, a quiet command that seemed to still the room. Even he, for a fraction of a second, fell silent. She let the pause linger, just long enough to make every second stretch. Then, with precision, she laid out the facts calmly, methodically, like an attorney dismantling a flimsy case point by point. Every claim he had made, every distorted statistic, every talking point he'd tried to bludgeon her with, she unraveled them all. The cameras caught every beat. The way her brow furrowed just slightly as she hit a particularly damning point. The faint nod from a colleague seated a few chairs down, the barely suppressed smirk of an aide who knew this was the moment that would dominate headlines. And then came the pivot, the shift from facts to something deeper. Something that reached beyond that chamber and into living rooms across America. "You see, Senator," she said, her voice softening but somehow carrying more weight. "For people like me, people who grew up being told that our voices didn't matter, this moment isn't just about you and me. It's about everyone who's ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. It's about every immigrant family that's been told they don't belong. It's about every young black girl who's been told to shrink herself just to make others comfortable." Words landed like a drumbeat, slow and steady, each one building on the last. In the back of the room, an aide lowered her eyes, blinking hard against the emotion welling there. Across the chamber, a colleague leaned back, exhaling softly as if he'd just witnessed a shift he couldn't quite name but couldn't deny. "And you can yell." "Senator," she continued, her voice unshaken, "you can try to make this about me, but the truth is, this isn't about me at all. It's about a country that is tired of being bullied, tired of being told to wait their turn, tired of being told they don't belong in the rooms where decisions are made about their lives." Scott tried to interject a quick, sharp "now. Wait, but the gavel came down from the chair, a firm rap that restored the floor to her. The interruption only made her next words sharper. "So, if standing here, calm and unshaken, while you try to shout me down makes me an embarrassment in your eyes, then I'll take that. I'll wear it proudly. Because what I won't do, Senator, what I will never do, is let arrogance and noise drown out the voices of the people I came here to represent." The chamber was silent. The kind of silence that feels alive, buzzing, with the electricity of a moment no one saw coming but everyone knew would matter. A reporter in the corner tilted her head almost involuntarily, whispering under her breath, "Oh my God." A staffer, careful to keep his expression neutral, curled his hands into fists under the table to keep from clapping. And somewhere in that quiet, you could almost hear the click of 1,000 record buttons across America, ready to make this clip immortal. Jasmine sat back slightly, her gaze unwavering, her tone steady but final. And then, in the line that would ricochet across social media, headline articles, and late-night monologues for weeks to come, she delivered the sentence that turned the chamber into stunned silence. "Respect," she said, her voice like tempered. "Steel isn't given because you yell the loudest. It's earned by how you carry yourself when the world is watching."
Ow.
And today, Senator, the world is watching. No one moved.
Oh.
No one spoke. Not even Tim Scott, who sat rigid in his chair,
Ow.
the redness in his cheeks betraying the calm facade he struggled to maintain. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, profound. The kind of silence that signals something irreversible has happened. And in that silence, a movement began. Asterisk. That's why this moment didn't just go viral. It became unforgettable. Because deep down, people are tired of the chaos, the shouting, the endless cycle of noise. What Jasmine Crockett showed the world that day is that calm courage will always outshine empty rage. And that's a lesson worth replaying, again and again. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity is stronger than arrogance, that truth is louder than hate, then don't just watch this moment. Be a part of it. Share this story. Send it to someone who needs a reminder that they don't have to shout to be powerful. Their quiet strength is enough. This platform is more than just videos. It's a movement of truth. It's of resilience. of everyday people standing tall in the face of noise. When you subscribe, you're not just clicking a button, you're joining a community that believes in something bigger. That in an era where outrage trends, integrity can still go viral. So if you're ready to help amplify voices that deserve to be heard, if you want to be part of this movement of calm courage over chaos, then hit that subscribe button. Like, share, comment. Because the more we tell these stories, the more we remind the world that grace, dignity, and truth still matter. Because one thing is clear. This wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's moment. It was ours. And together, we can make sure it's only the beginning.